Well, let's continue here tonight on The Pulse. The Standard Bank has withdrawn its mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy today, 3 days after finance union Sasbo vowed to fight the policy after at least 40 of its members were dismissed by the bank for non-compliance. For more on this, we're joined by employment and labour law specialist Osborne Molatudi. Osborne, good evening. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Interesting that despite the fact that we no longer have COVID-19 regulations, including the strictest of them all, which is wearing a mask, you still have some employees that are being dismissed for not getting the vaccine.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for having me on your show again. I would imagine that decision to have terminated the employment of those affected employees would have been taken prior to the promulgation of the new regulations doing away with the wearing of masks in the public. But very lately, we have now read that Standard Bank is considering to rehire some of those employees. This will be a factual issue, which I believe Standard Bank will confirm it in due course. But be that as it may, the employers will still be able to justify their decisions to have terminated the employment of those affected employees if they can show that they followed a fair process and in accordance with a fair procedure for a valid reason. And one of those it will be for them being able to demonstrate that they conducted a risk assessment prior to implementing a mandatory vaccination policy.
Osborne, it was always going to be a sticky point because to a large extent we had a point where many employers were waiting to see whether government itself was going to go ahead and implement, vaccine mandates before following route in their own organizations. What happens now for those organizations that did go that route, and what kind of precedent would the decision at Standard Bank to rehire these employees then have for other organizations?
Yes, I think the decision by Standard Bank will no doubt set an unprecedented precedent for other affected employers who may have implemented mandatory vaccination policies in their workplace. And I say this for the following reasons. One, that decision may strengthen the cases of those employees who may have taken Standard Bank to the CCMA or any other affected employee for that matter and use Standard Bank as a precedent. Or it may result in Standard Bank being required to conclude mutual separation based on their decision to reconsider, because as matters stand, we are not certain if that is the position. It may well be that they're still seeking legal advice. But if they do want to implement that decision, it may want to conclude mutual agreements in order to ameliorate the effects of the previous terminations. And I guess the other defense will be, in terms of that old code, which required employees to wear masks both in the private, workplace and in the public. We believe we followed a fair process. But as I say, the biggest implication is that it may set a very awkward precedent for other affected employees who may have implemented mandatory vaccination policies in their respective workplaces.
It's not an easy time for the employees who would have been fired here in this instance. I can imagine they've been through a lot of emotional turmoil and stress. Does this U-turn give them any kind of leeway to take action against Standard Bank, especially should they feel disgruntled to the point where they don't want their jobs back, but want some kind of culpability or liability, rather?
Indeed, and I've spoken about this previously, yes. And, those employees who may not have declared unfair dismissal disputes, for whatever reasons, they may then see this as an opportunity to say, now you're admitting that you may have been wrong in implementing this policy. It's now our turn to institute a civil action against you and sue you for damages. And to sort of use that as a bargaining tool to negotiate for a better compensation. Because I would imagine this decision would not necessarily relate the dismissed employees will relate to those who may have lost their employment as a result of them refusing to undergo the vaccination in terms of Standard Bank's mandatory vaccination policy. And there will be a whole series of implications. But at the end of the day, it will be about what one would term adequate compensation. And employees will take full advantage of this gesture from Standard Bank. However, Kathy, I must mention that won't be the end of the road for Standard Bank, because another way of resolving labor disputes in forums such as the CCM and the Labor Court is to make what you call a with prejudice offer. And Standard Bank may use this as that kind of offer falling within that category. So in other words, they say we are making an on-record offer such that if we decline it, we would ask the arbitrator, the adjudicator, to take it into account at the end of the proceedings. So, for instance, if it's an offer of money and you decline it, and at the end of the day you win the case which awards you money, it will be that money minus that which you were previously offered. Labor law is not complicated. It's about fairness and equity. And fairness and equity means what reasonable steps did you take to mitigate, the negative effects of your action from an employment law perspective.
Osborne Molatudi, let me thank you for your time tonight.